Good morning or afternoon, everybody. TGIFF, thank goodness, it's FSMA Friday. Welcome. Today our topic is what you need to know now about the new Foreign Supplier Verification Program and third-party auditor rules. This topic has so much to it, we've decided to make it a two-parter. So we're going to start today, and then we'll get more in-depth during next month's FSMA Friday, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. I'm Barbara Levin with SafetyChain, your host as always. Before we begin, let me give you some housekeeping. If you're having technical issues, we are being hosted on this webinar today by WebEx, and you can call their technical support directly at 877-509-3239. If you're online but you have other technical questions and you haven't lost your connection, you can also go out of full screen and send a question to host. Everybody will get a copy of the recording. That'll be available by close of business on Monday. You'll get an email where you'll be able to download those. Questions can be submitted online. As always, we're going to start with some pre-submitted questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And for your privacy, you can see the names of the hosts and the presenters only, and your name and not the names of the other attendees. We're very excited to have on our FSMA Friday team today Dr. David Acheson and Melanie Newman, and myself, of course. Don't think we need to say too much. A lot of you have been on several, but there's no better FSMA team there around. And we're just going to start right off with some of these pre-submitted questions. And David, as always, we start with, before we get into our topic, what's the latest and greatest updates from the FDA on FSMA? And welcome.
Thank you, Barbara, and welcome to everybody who's joined us today. Not a lot of updates in the last month. I think probably one of the most interesting ones is there's been this continued tussle between the legal system and consumer organizations and FDA over timelines and deadlines, and FDA was trying to push back and the judge wasn't having anything of it. So where we've kind of landed up here is we're looking at mid-15 to have all this stuff wrapped up, mid-2015. So that's probably the biggest news is that that's still on the legal trajectory. Personal David comment on that is I think FDA will do it when FDA does it, and hopefully they do it right and not fast. To me, that's more important, and probably to everybody on this phone, it's more important to get it right than fast. And I have to sort of, again, editorial David comment is, so what's the consequence to FDA if they take a little longer? I can't imagine that that we'll see Mr. Taylor in an orange jumpsuit, but hey, you know, that's kind of the update. That's kind of the update, Barbara. So
okay.
Let's launch into some real stuff.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to skip over to Melanie for a few questions here. Melanie, one of the pre-submitted questions was, you know, obviously we can spend the whole time on this, but at a high level, what are some of the basic elements of the foreign supplier verification programs and some of the things that importers need to do? Some of the things we've been asked to have you mention are how we identify foreign suppliers, where does hazard analysis fit in, what are some tools, and what happens when there are gaps?
Great. Thanks, Barbara, and thanks everyone again for joining. It's great to be back on FSMA Friday. You know, at the highest level, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rule is all about making suppliers and importers, making importers accountable to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act on the highest level, but also all of its amendments, and most recently the Food Safety Modernization Act, and most specifically the Preventive Controls and the Produce Safety Rule. So I'll dig a little bit deeper into these questions that you've posed, Barbara. So importers under this rule need to identify who their foreign suppliers are and also what foods that they are importing. Oftentimes importers may not even have this robust type of list, or they may not know what exact products foreign suppliers are importing for them. So this will actually go into a database that FDA will use to monitor and enforce compliance going forward. Importers also need to perform a hazard analysis on the foods that they're importing to ensure that they understand the hazards that are reasonably likely to occur in association with these products, and to make sure that those hazards are being controlled adequately in some fashion. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. How are they going to ensure that those hazards are being controlled? Importers also need to verify their foreign suppliers are using food safety processes in a way that's ensuring public health and safety to the same level as the preventive controls or the produce safety rule, depending upon the product that they are importing. And how do they do this? Through a variety of means. They can do on-site audits, lot-by-lot sampling, reviewing food safety records from the foreign suppliers. But again, it goes back to accountability. Gone are the days where you can accept a piece of paper, a C of A that has a foreign supplier saying, hey, yep, I tested out, I'm good enough, here's a piece of paper that says my product's safe and good. The importers now have to go actually physically take action and do something to verify that these products coming into the U.S. meet U.S. food safety standards in a way that's a verifiable, action-oriented way. If there are gaps, the importer needs to resolve the problem. They need to take action, or they need to stop using the supplier.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. We're gonna keep you on for a few minutes. So for the foreign supplier verification program, again, who does the proposed rule cover and what foods are impacted? Kind of what's in and what's out, and who's in and who's out?
Well, pretty much everyone's in. Kind of a you're in except type of a rule. Importers are in, foreign suppliers are in, third-party auditing firms are in, and all foods are in. What are the exceptions? It's probably easier to talk about who's out, or what's subject to some modified requirements. Exceptions are seafood and juiced HACCP. If you fall under those categories, you would be excluded from the rule. Food for research and evaluation, or food for personal consumption. Certain alcoholic beverages are also excluded from this rule, Barbara, as are transshipped goods. Now, there's going to be some categories also that are subject to some modified requirements. Little guys, for example. There's a category for very small importers and importers with very small suppliers. Also, special rules for the dietary supplement category. This is kind of the first time we're seeing dietary supplements get hit with some of these new rules very specifically. But there's going to be some modified requirements for them. And lastly, importers who are importing food from countries that have been officially recognized by FDA as having equivalent food safety standards to that of the U.S.
Okay. Okay, well, let's see. We're going to take the heat off of you just for a little while and turn to David. David, when will importers be required to perform on-site audits of their foreign suppliers? I know that there's several options that we're going to talk about in depth next month, but maybe you can kind of give us a big picture here.
No, sure. This is an interesting, I think, twist in this proposed rule, Barbara, that the FDA has basically said we're putting out here two options in this proposal, and they have logically called them option 1 and option 2. And as Melanie has said, the goal here is to make the importers accountable for their foreign supply chain. And there's clearly a number of ways that you could be accountable, but that's the key word, accountability. And essentially, the option 1 at a high level is, as Melanie said, you conduct a hazard analysis, much like a preventive control type approach, and you determine those hazards that are reasonably likely to occur using the same thought process. And once you've got that list, you go audit those guys. You've got to be there, or you've got to use a third-party auditor. More about that, I think, a little later in the session. If they're not designated as a risk reasonably likely to occur, high-level serious adverse health, then there are other ways that in option one that one can meet the requirement. Option two is, yeah, you still need to figure out who's high risk and who's not, but it's much broader in terms of the way you handle it. It's basically say, figure out the list, and then you, Mr. Importer, you go figure out how you're going to control this risk. It's much broader. It's much, I wouldn't say it's much less prescriptive. It is less prescriptive. And it's essentially, we have these two options. And as you said, we'll do a deeper dive into these two options and explore them more in the next FSMA Friday, a month from now. I think another part to this, which we will touch on there, that's somewhat relevant to this whole question, is how is FDA defining an importer? Somebody is maybe saying, well, is this rule going to hit me? And we're going to do a much deeper dive into that, because there's a few little twists and nuances that frankly surprise me in that. And it's not quite the same way it was laid out in the law of the, quote, importer of record. It's much more like, who's bought the food? Who is this food going to be used for? And there was certainly concern that maybe a broker or an importer who's just pushing paper would be the accountable party. I'm not sure that's actually going to be the way it's playing out. So we'll do a deeper dive into that one too a month from now. But that's another piece of this. I think there'll be people who will be folded into this who were thinking they wouldn't be. So interesting twist on that one as well.
And I'm sure if it surprised you, David, it's probably surprising most people. So we'll look forward to that. We're gonna stay with you here for a little while longer. It's really kind of three questions in one here on the third-party audit rule. Can you tell us a little bit about how the rule will work? What will audit certificates be used for, and does it apply all over the world, and if not, why?
Yeah, again, this sort of gets into what's the third-party audit program all about. And let's remember that what this is about was a way to leverage private sector expertise and resources to help protect the U.S. food supply with regard to imported foods. Let me flip this around and sort of say, where does this apply geographically? It does not apply domestically at all. If you think about the mechanisms whereby FDA, quote, inspects food, domestically it's federal, it's state, and it's local. That is the way it's set up now, and this does not change. There is no role for private third-party auditors under the umbrella of FDA to be doing anything on the domestic front. So the third-party audit is entirely outside of the U.S. How does it work? Well, I see this as a three-part process. Part one is FDA sets a standard, and the Preventive Control Rule, the Produce Rule, other components of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that sets the standard. So think of it as a high bar. The FDA has set the bar at a certain level. You, as a manufacturer and importer, have got to jump over that bar. Next, step two, once the standards are set, step two is how is the FDA going to set up a program that those who are providing the certificates know what they're doing, that the certificates are meaningful, that there's no conflicts of interest, that there's no scurrilous activity going on. Well, the way that FSMA laid this out in the law and the way it's coming out in the proposed rule is that the FDA will approve certain accreditation bodies. So the accreditation body is going to be and it can be anybody can be an accreditor. They have to apply. There's a formal process. There's loads of details in the proposed rule about what constitutes a good accreditor. There's lots of records got to be kept, lots of transparency. There's lots of issues around conflict of interest. But the FDA determines that somebody is back to my high bar analogy, the bar is set. There is a judge standing next to the bar making sure you clear it. You've got to get over it. You hit the bar, you're out. So the accreditor, think of them as like the police force or the judge watching the process, watching the system, and the accreditor will accredit a third-party auditor. That's step 3. Step 3 is the third-party auditor. That could be a private individual, it could be a company, it can be a group, it can be a foreign government. And the accreditor is essentially policing them to make sure they follow the rules. Are they properly trained? Do they not have conflicts? Are they following the rules? Are they reporting things to FDA that they should be reporting to FDA? Are they keeping the right records? And the onus is on the accreditor to be tracking and following and watching and policing the third party who is issuing the certificates. Finally, what are those certificates going to be used for? There's really 3 things they could be used for. They will be used by the FDA for foods that the agency designates as high risk. It's in FSMA. They have the authority to designate foods that could be a commodity, it could be from a region, it could be from a country, just saying this food is high risk and it will need a certificate to come into the US. This is the process whereby you get the certificate. Second box, voluntary qualified importer program, which I've used the analogy of it's like at the airport where you're cleared for TSA pre, you get the fast lane because you're pre-approved, you're a frequent traveler. It's analogous to that. There's a pre-approval process. You get your voluntary qualified importer program certificate through this also. We don't have a proposed Rule 1 on that. We don't have guidances on that, so much more to come. The third area where these certificates will be used is for the foreign supplier verification. We said earlier that importers are going to have some on-site audit in certain situations. These certificates will serve to provide that on-site audit. It's complicated in many ways, yet it's logical that you set the standard, you establish a police force, and you deliver. Those are the 3 steps. And that's how it's going to work. And there is masses of language in this proposed rule around conflicts and records. And we'll get into more of that a month from now because, again, there's some interesting twists here whereby these third-party auditors need to tell the FDA when they see things that aren't right. And interestingly, they have to tell the FDA before they tell their client. So I see some interesting twists and nuances in that. But more to come on that one a month from now. Sorry that was such a long-winded answer.
No, it was a great answer. David, there's been a lot of discussion as to GFSI and how that's going to fit into all of this. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, you're right. Lots of discussion on this one. As many as I know, as you know, and as many on the phone probably know, we have done some comparative analysis between the preventive control rules and the SQF Level 2 modules, and they are very, very well aligned. And my view of this, and this is just personal opinion, is that the GFSI schemes will match up ultimately, and if they're not quite there, they will adjust to be very comparable to this standard that I was talking about, this bar that needs to be set. I think they're already extremely close. So they will meet that standard. Now, the interesting question here is that if I've got a GFSI audit today, does that mean that I've got what I need for these certificates? And my view of that will be no, because the GFSI, those that are delivering the GFSI audit will need to be certified. So the accreditation body is going to have to certify them, accredit them, and then they will be able to do an audit which will meet this standard. So I think ultimately this is all going to roll into one system. There'll be some minor tweaks and adjustments on the GFSI side. I think there's some interesting nuances here that we've talked about in some of our newsletters just recently. Is this potentially going to create dual standards and other concerns, which again we can get into when we talk a month from now, when we talk about this in more detail. But it does fit, for sure it fits, and I think the GFSI schemes will just sort of merge with the federal schemes when this is all said and done.
Okay. Let's see, we are going to open it up for questions in just a moment here. And what I'm going to do to facilitate this is come out of full screen. You can start to submit your questions now on the lower right-hand side. You'll see a Q&A tab. You can enter your question there and hit send. Let me give you a little bit of information while we're waiting for some of those to queue up. September 27th is part 2 of today's foreign supplier verification and third-party session. Some of the things that we're going to be covering is the definition and requirements for qualified individual. We're going to discuss on-site audits. When can they be used for supplier compliance verification and what factors apply? Really interested in getting David and the team and Melanie's overall impression of this FSVP rule. We're going to discuss how third-party auditors have to report, and of course we're going to take your questions live. So very excited about that coming up. And now we'll get to your questions. A couple quick reminders. Here's the schedule for FSMA Fridays coming up. As new news comes out, we update the schedule. You can see the latest and greatest there. We've got some great webinars coming up that you can register for at SafetyChain.com. If you are going to be impacted by the produce rule, actually at 1 o'clock Eastern today, we're going to be doing a how-to demo day. We follow all FSMA Fridays with a how to automate. This is from last month's event. There's still some seats. You can go to our website and register for that. And with that, let's get to some of these questions that we've got really lining up here. Questions for, excuse me, I'm going to give this one to you, Melanie, from Phil Brooks. Is there a different process or procedure if we're importing from Canada and Canada has implemented a preventive control program that's equivalent to the U.S.'s? Would we still be required to jump through all the hoops?
Not at this time. They may ultimately qualify for one of those modified exemptions I talked about, where FDA may ultimately deem them to be a country that has the comparable standards to U.S. food safety laws. But right now, they would still be deemed a foreign supplier, just as though that they would be sourcing from, India, for example. So as of now, you would have to treat them as though they would fall under this rule and follow the parameters of this rule at this time.
Just to add on what Melanie said there is, I'm sure as Phil knows, there's a lot of discussion going on right now between the two sets of federal governments about looking specifically at the border crossings between the U.S. and Canada with regard to food. So with that particular country, there's a number of other forces at play. But right now, I think Melanie's dead right. I've seen nothing that would treat Canada any differently from any other country.
Okay. Let's see, David, another question. Can we rely on the third-party audit certificate supplied by a foreign supplier?
Well, the FDA is going to rely on them for the voluntary qualified importer program and the certificate for the high-risk food. That's the whole point of the program, is to establish a program that FDA feels is reliable through training and oversight and so on. I think it does to me raise this question that I alluded to when I was talking about this a few minutes ago, is that if you're a manufacturer or a retailer and you are currently dependent on a third-party audit, and will this process drive the certified auditors who are doing this for FDA into a slightly different place? Will the audit be quite the same? Will it be quite what a retailer wants? And I could see, as I mentioned earlier, that we may end up with some, even though I think GFSI will ultimately all sort of merge together with these federal requirements, you may see situations where certain retailers or manufacturers demand a GFSI plus, and because they're going to look at this and say, this isn't quite meeting our needs. We need a little more than this. So if the government's going to rely on it, and to the extent that that gives you confidence, then go with it.
Great, thank you. Melanie, Steve is asking, will packaging requirements be addressed versus actual produce?
Right now, I have not seen specifically packaging being addressed in the foreign supplier verification rule. You know, if it's specific to that vis-a-vis produce, I guess I'm not exactly sure where he might be going with that question. But I'll kick it to David and see if he's got any comments as well.
No, I think Melanie's right. I've not seen anything on packaging either. But remember that my interpretation of this is that it is applicable to the whole Act. So the rules and laws around packaging as they exist today would be part and parcel of that in theory, as would labeling and everything else. But I don't see it going beyond what the current requirements are for packaging.
Sure. Thank you. David, from Cindy, should we be concerned that we need to do the same auditing on of domestic suppliers? Are guarantees not going to cut it anymore?
Well, as I mentioned, the domestic supplier system doesn't change. This doesn't impact domestic at all. So if you are currently relying on a third-party audit domestically or a second-party audit, you're making a business decision, an informed one, I'm assuming, that you're accepting a third-party audit from certain certifiers, from certain audit groups to a certain standard. If you're comfortable with that today, this isn't going to change that. It isn't going to have any impact on that whatsoever, because this program is entirely related to food that is being imported into the United States. So it really doesn't change that. So if you've got confidence in what you're doing today in your audit systems, then stick with it. If you don't have confidence in those systems, then change them.
Okay, great. Let's see, David. Since you've got the virtual mic, I'll start with you on this one, and then Mel, if you've got anything to add. From Jennifer, what can manufacturers start doing now to ensure their domestic vendors are aware of the FSVP and are working to meet requirements? What documentation should they have in place?
That's a great question, and I think my view of the answer to that is going right back to the changes and the shifts that are going to be needed in relation to the preventive control rules. We've said before, Barbara, and I've said many times in lots of situations, is through my lens, 95% of what's in the preventive control proposed rule is going to stay. A few things will change, I suspect. We'll get some clarity in certain areas, and there may be a few additions. So my recommendation to that question is get focused on those requirements, food safety plan thinking, the records that you need to be compliant with that, the hazard analysis, the corrective actions, the monitoring, the validations. Do all that stuff because you will need it, and kind of do a gap analysis. See where you are in your facility today compared with where you need to be going down the road. This is going to set you up for a good place for moving into the future. And if you're buying from a foreign manufacturer, then it's going to be important to educate them. They need to understand that these preventive control rules have got some substance to them. And the expectation on the foreign supplier verification is that the foreign registered manufacturing and processing firms will be compliant with these new rules. So what should you do is take that information to your foreign manufacturer, your foreign supplier, and make sure they understand what they're going to have to do to get over this hurdle. Melanie?
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely agree with David's comments, and I will just echo that record keeping is more critical than ever before, and if it's not documented, it did not happen in the eyes of the agency. So when you do that gap analysis, really take a critical eye to what are you documenting now, where are the gaps, are people taking liberties or vacations with the documentation, and really reinstitute the importance of documentation. And to the degree you're keeping those documents and those records manually, really, I strongly encourage you, to the degree you can, keep and move towards an electronic platform to keep your records and your documents and to store and manage that. To the degree you can leverage technology to help you manage your risk, you will do yourself a favor, because you can take the human element of error out of it, and in the long run, it will pay off. There will be an ROI at the end of that.
Okay. We have time for just one or two more questions. Melanie, while we've got you here, how do you determine what a high-risk food is? This is from Corrine. How would you go about evaluating the potential for adulteration?
Well, as far as evaluating the potential for adulteration, that's what the preventive controls rule asks us to do by conducting our hazard analysis, by starting with identifying all potential hazards and then drilling that down to those that are reasonably likely to occur. As far as the high-risk foods that David had mentioned earlier, that's a list that FDA will be predefining for us, that FDA has not yet defined. And David can add to that.
Yeah, exactly, Barbara. This list, this high-risk list, gives that FDA actually has a lot of leeway in how to define that. They can define this in the way of, we're just going to simply say a whole commodity is high risk, and they just pick a commodity and it just goes global. This commodity, wherever it's from, is high risk. They could take that same commodity and say this commodity from country X is high risk. They could regionalize it and say this product from region X and country Y is high risk. And frankly, I think they could take it down to the manufacturer level. There's a lot of leeway in this. And what are they going to consider to be high risk? I've had conversations with FDA about this in the past, and they basically said, David, use your imagination. And what that tells me is if you've ever been linked to a recall, illnesses, problems, then you're going to be on this high-risk list, potentially. And that's kind of the way I see this playing out.
David, Lionel is asking, how will brokers be affected?
Yeah, great question. I think that this gets back to how we're defining an importer in the context of this new proposed rule, foreign supply verification. The broker, by the definition in FSMA, could clearly be the importer of record. I think the twists and turns that I'm seeing in the foreign supply verification proposed rule is, as I mentioned earlier, that shifts a little bit. And it may be that if the broker is not using the food, they may not be the ones who have to carry the can on this one. It may actually be the person that the broker is selling the food to. And I think there's definitely a mindset out there with the people could say, I don't need to worry about this. The broker will have to carry the water on this one. Not so quick. And we need to dive into this one a whole lot more a month from now, which we will, because I think that's an interesting question and an interesting nuance. But if the broker is going to use the food, the broker is on the hook. But how many brokers manufacture food? Not many.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a lot of additional questions. Unfortunately, we're just about 5 minutes over our hard stop. We will keep these questions. We'll check with the team and see if we can add some time on for the next one. Maybe make it 45 minutes instead of 30. And I know we promised everybody we'd have you done. This obviously is a hot topic of a lot of interest. So I want to thank you very much to our FSMA Friday team, to David and Melanie today. Thanks to everybody who's been on and for all of the questions. And as I said, if you're on today, if you're registered, you don't have to re-register. We will keep all of these questions, and we will we'll try to get to as many of them as we can next month. So with that, everybody, have a fabulous day, and TGIFF, everybody.